So the next bit is cognition, and cognition and memory. So again, I mean, I've got this up here, but it's slightly different because here you've got, and I've mentioned this already, you've got metacognition in there. This isn't strictly metacognition. It's not like SRSD. It's not like self-regulated strategy, etc. So it's not strictly metacognition. But you know, obviously, metacognition's up there as being consistent, as being something there. But this is more specifically about what works in terms of memory, what works in terms of. And I've talked already about the difference between performance and learning. What heightens learning? So a lot of the slides that I'm going to bring up are from this. It's a 2007 paper. It's like a guidance report from the States called a practice guide. But what they tried to set out and do in this, if you can download this online, by the way, it's brilliant. And they looked at books for initial teacher training, and they looked at the things that the researchers said are unequivocal in terms of what makes the biggest difference in terms of memory, in terms of cognition, in terms of learning. And they examined a whole suite of textbooks aimed at initial teacher training to see how much coverage there were of these areas. Of the 7 recommendations, they didn't find coverage of any of the 6 in there. Only one, which was questioning, was in there. So this is a bit of a mind-blowing thing, isn't it? There are things that make the most fundamental difference in terms of learning, and they're not in the books. And certainly I can remember, you know, when I was at college, not looking at any of this stuff. So here's the list. So what I'm going to do, there are 7 things in there. One of the comments from this was, how can we deal with this all at a time? But there is a potential logical order in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out 3 of these things and discuss them in a little bit more depth. Feel free to stop me as I go through though. So the first thing, and it fits in with the mastery approach, is interleaving worked examples with problem solving exercises. Does interleaving sound familiar? First of all, yeah, okay, good. Okay, so this is what your students can study. What is interleaving? Students shouldn't study one idea, topic or problem for too long. Instead, you should change it often, but of course not too often. Interleaving makes things harder, and I've already talked about Bjork's idea of desirable difficulties. It makes it harder than studying one type of material. It's particularly useful for example, problem solving, maths, physics, etc. So for example, to make it a bit simpler, if you're studying multiplication, you shouldn't do multiplication, 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 multiplication questions. You should interleave multiplication and division. So you should alternate between the two and make the connections all the time. But you still see teachers giving worksheets out which just say multiplication, 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 because they think that maths practice makes a difference. It doesn't. It doesn't. It heightens performance, but it doesn't heighten learning. But more specifically, it's how often should teachers switch? So it's a very important thing to consider. It's good to switch. You don't want to switch too often. So again, these are the things that we'll explore. Otherwise, it looks like multitasking. So what should you do when interleaving? Don't just switch and forget about each idea. Make links, and that's the example I just gave you of multiplication and division. And interleaving isn't enough. That you need to have interleaving needs to work with effective strategies such as retrieval practice. So, brief summary of the evidence. There's a large number of laboratory experiments and a small number of classroom studies, which have demonstrated that students learn more than alternating between studying examples of worked out problems and then solving problems on their own when they are given problems to solve. And when I say that, they're given one problem to solve. So again, maybe this is like a mastery effect. You give one problem that's a work solution. You work through that problem. You give the pupils just one problem to solve, and you do that, and you hold that really tightly in terms of the teaching. So in a series of laboratory experiments in algebra, researchers at 8 and 9, obviously it's in the States, 8th and 9th grade students in the treatment condition alternate between 4 pairs of solutions and examples. Students in the control were simply asked to solve 8 problems, so they didn't have that interleaving between worked examples. Students in the interleaved example problem treatment group not only took less time to complete the 8 problems, they also performed better. So you can see that interleaving, even though over a period of time, is going to make a difference in terms of that durable learning. Another study in computer programming found that if students are given 6 examples before the 6 problems, they learn significantly less than if the examples are interleaved, with the same 6 examples and 6 problems alternating in order. So again, it's that desirable difficulties. An example in maths. So a similar instruction, some class activities are replaced with worked example study. The results show a dramatic acceleration in learning that the pupils finished a 3-year course in 2 years with better performance than the other control pupils. So you can see that interleaving has a profound effect in terms of durable learning. So how to carry out the recommendation? In whole class situations, a teacher might implement this by recommending the class to have a discussion around an example, followed by small groups of individuals studying just one problem. The teacher then directs them back to study an example. For example, having pupils present their solutions and having others attempt to explain the steps. Can you see metacognition in there? When they're explaining this is what we have to do through the processes. Again, after studying this worked example, the pupils are given a second problem to solve. Again, this follows the principles of interleaving worked examples. Does it sound familiar? Is interleaving something that you actively practice in your schools? No. Okay. Okay, roadblocks. Well, one roadblock here, and this is why doing this collaboratively is better. Curriculum materials don't provide teachers with worked examples. You see it sometimes now in Singapore maths books, etc., but not that often. So actually working through and working collaboratively in groups of teachers to actually have worked examples that might draw out misconceptions is a really valuable exercise to do. Okay, so that's a very, very quick guide to interleaving. Retrieval practice just fascinates me. So I think it's a bit dangerous to give this type, but you might have heard this in a different name, which is just the testing effect. Retrieval practice basically involves retrieving something in the past that you've known and bringing it forward into working memory. So the process of retrieving makes information more retrieval. So there are processes that you can go to make retrieving information easier. So how should you practice retrieval? There are many different ways to implement the process, and you probably do it already. So practice tests, practice questions in your textbook. But the one aspect of this is they should be low stakes. If they're high stakes, they're focused on the duress that it's causing them. One teacher suggested that teachers shouldn't even take the low stakes tests in, that people should just keep them themselves, in which case all they're practicing and doing is the retrieval. I'm just concentrating on thinking back to what I know before. I'm not concentrating that someone's going to look at my work. I'm not concentrating on any of those aspects. I'm just thinking, what do I know before? How can I bring it back into my memory again? So it doesn't have to be as formal as tests. It can be just questions that you ask. So that you're sitting there and you're asking a question, I want you to think about this, bring it forward into your memory. So it can be as informal as that, and the research suggests it works as well for EYFS as it does for Key Stage 2 and onwards. Flashcards are useful, and again there's a metacognitive aspect in flashcards as well. So what should you do after retrieval? And the research is very clear, you should give feedback. Because if they've retrieved something within their memory and there's a misconception there, of course, if they haven't got the feedback to correct that, then the misconception is what's taken forward. So giving immediate feedback to it. So Doug Leboff, is everyone familiar with Doug Leboff's work? American author, the North Star Charter Schools in New Jersey. He calls his retrieval practice, he does it every morning, and he calls them do nows. And in maths, it's a 5 to 7 minute activity. Does this sound familiar? You do it. So do we. Every morning. Do nows, bring it up, 5 to 7 minute activity. And this again fits in with Rosenshine's principles of instruction. The first thing you should do is retrieve information that you've learnt previously. So 5 to 7 minutes of just activities, questions that they've done before that the pupils work on. And this is a really neat experiment from 2006. So just to exemplify this, so you've got 3 groups here in this experiment. So group 1 studied, did a distractor task, studied, did a distractor task, studied, distractor, studied, distractor. Group 2, studied, distractor, studied, distractor, studied, distractor, test. Group 3, studied, distractor, test, distractor, test, distractor, test, distractor. Okay, so what happened after they did this? And there's numerous experiments which exemplify this. So 5 minutes later when they had an assessment, of course the study, because they've had more opportunities to study, remembered more. The study test were next, and the study test, of course, because they hadn't had as much chance to study, didn't remember as much. However, when they did the same test again a week later, it was all reversed. So study was here, study test, remembered more, and study test. And what isn't on here is when they did it a month later, it had gone up even more, and the study test, it was over 50% more that they remembered compared to study. But what I'm not doing is standing here going, just test your pupils, because that would be wrong. So it's how we do this that doesn't put the pupils under too much strain, but then also has the benefits over long-term learning in terms of retrieval practice. I think one of the interesting things was that when I first heard about this, which was maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I was kind of, this makes a profound difference, doesn't it, in terms of what you do in the classroom. And so what I did was, I thought, God, I went back and I looked at my data. So being a Year 6 teacher, you do the same things, don't you, every single time during the course of the year. So I went back and I looked at 6 years of my own data, analysed the data to see where I was putting more testing in effect. And of course, being a Year 6 teacher, after January, I was doing more SATs papers. And I looked at my data, and the data kind of goes like this. Some years it went a bit flat, and some years it went up a little bit. And then in term 2, it went like this. Every single year, apart from one year, 2011, it did something different. Every year, I could see when I was employing retrieval practice, it was there in the data. I never knew it was in the data until I'd seen the research, until I went back into the analysis. The only time it wasn't was 2011, when it just went like that. And that was when I took over as head of my school, and I walked into the classroom the first time, taught a maths lesson, walked out with my head in my hands, thinking, I can't believe there's really bright kids here, and the standards are they just don't know anything. I am petrified of what's going on here. And all the things that I would normally do January time, I put in September. And I could see it in the data because they just went straight up, because I was doing retrieval practice. Lots of low-stake tests that were spaced out. All the things that they say in the EF toolkit, effective feedback, metacognition, all the things that I was doing in January. So basically I was a kind of rubbish teacher until January, and then started doing the things which research suggests I should have done. But I could see it in my data. It was very clear that over a 6-year period, I started doing this, and it made a difference, so the pupils' data went up.
James, do you not think that's about how you collect the data though? Because you didn't collect it through a test.
Yes, the assessment makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yes,
absolutely.
If you were perhaps not doing it through a test, then you would get maybe a different set.
And that's one of the interesting things that we need to find out, isn't it? Does retrieval work when you're not focused on just a single test? Of course, we are all tested. So, but that would be interesting, isn't it? But it highlights actually what you're saying is the validity of the questions that you're asking in the first place, and making sure that they correspond with the information or the test that we're having in the future. But you're right. Because in the 100-year history of it, then people retrieve information much better on things like poetry, of course, than they do random information. But again, there are reasons for that, aren't there? Okay, and then that fits in with space practice, otherwise known as distributed theory. And I think one of the things that we need to remember is that, and this is Ebbinghouse's forgetting curve, which we're all familiar with. You know, you start up here, I remember all this, and of course after 31 days, we remember whatever it is, 21%. But we must remember that forgetting is a really important component of remembering, a really important component of learning. So space practice is basically when you space out your learning over a much longer period of time. Doing this way, the same amount of study time will produce longer lasting effects. It makes absolute sense, doesn't it? So for example, in the Key Stage 2 science curriculum, I always think it's just ridiculous that pupils meet things in Year 3 that they don't meet again until secondary school. How the devil are they supposed to remember that unless you space it out over a period of time and come back and try and recall it? This comes back to retrieval practice that I mentioned earlier and Doug Lemoff's do nows. So how do you space your learning? Review information from each class, but not immediately after class. There is optimum spacing. So in terms of what we'd look at during the course of the year, we'd look at, and there's lots of data out there which suggests what are the optimum spaces between learning. To maximise retention, and the delay between spacing is important. Can you see, for me, all of this makes a fundamental difference in terms of curriculum design. Our curriculums are not designed for memory, which is just ridiculous, because how the brain works is absolutely fundamental to how pupils learn. We don't have spacing, we don't have retrieval, all these things that make a difference. The only problem is it's just a profound amount of work, isn't it? We've got to redesign our curriculum about it, but we really do, in my opinion. What should you do during these short learning sessions? It's important that students don't just sit down and reread notes. We've looked at that already. Study, study, study. Doesn't work. Instead, you should offer effective learning strategies such as retrieval practice. So can you see how these interleave, how they all work together to produce a system? So here's an example of spaced practice. So first learnt on day 1, reviewed again the next day, and then left for a couple of days till day 3, then left again until day 6, and then it might be left again until week 3, and then it might be left again until 2 months later. And there are optimum spaces. Sometimes it's better to leave things for weeks than it is for days, and then revisit them again. So even if it's for a 5-10 minute session, you know, one of the things that teachers say all the time, don't they, is that, oh, you remember it today, in 2 weeks' time you will have absolutely no clue about it, you know, in terms of assessment. So why haven't we got a curriculum which designs things so they do remember it? It's not a problem with the pupils a lot of the time, it's a problem with the curriculum.